At 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, I walked outside with a cup of coffee and found nearly every fish in my lake floating belly up. The water had turned a strange electric blue. The air smelled like a public swimming pool after closing time, and standing across the ridge beside her black SUV was the one woman who had spent 6 months trying to take that lake away from me. Her name was Cynthia Vale, president of the Silver Pines Property Association, and judging by the little smile on her face, she thought she had finally broken me. My name is Walter Briggs, though most folks around northern Idaho call me Walt, and at 63 years old I had already learned that there are two kinds of people who smile at another man's pain: fools who do not understand what they have done, and criminals who believe nobody can prove it. Cynthia was about to discover she was both. I set my coffee on the dock, opened the old metal tackle box I kept beneath the bench, and pulled out a handheld water tester my wife Ellen had given me on our 25th anniversary. I spent 34 years maintaining municipal water systems before a damaged spine put me into retirement, so I knew that color was not algae, and that smell was not some harmless seasonal change. The meter flashed a pH reading of 11.6. That number belonged in a cleaning solution, not in a spring-fed lake filled with rainbow trout. I stood there watching the silver bodies drift past the dock my father had built, and for a minute I could not breathe. Ellen and I had spent almost every morning on that dock during our 29 years together, drinking coffee, arguing about the weather, pretending not to notice when one of us stole the last cinnamon roll. When cancer made walking difficult, I built a railing so she could still reach the water. After she died, that lake became the only place where the house did not feel empty. I started taking wounded veterans fishing there on weekends, charging just enough to cover bait and fuel, because some men talk easier when their hands are busy and nobody is looking directly at them. Cynthia called it an unauthorized commercial enterprise. She first showed up carrying a leather folder and wearing boots that had probably never touched mud before. She looked at the old dock, the fishing boat, and the men laughing near the shoreline as though we had built a junkyard beside her dining room. "You cannot run a business here," she told me. I took a sip of coffee and said, "Cynthia, you do realize my land is not inside Silver Pines." She gave me the kind of patient smile people use before explaining something to a child. "Your property affects our community image, Walt. Community standards do not stop at technical boundary lines." That sentence told me almost everything I needed to know about her. The law was a technicality when it limited her power, but sacred scripture when she wanted to use it against someone else. 2 days later, I received a $2,800 fine for commercial activity, visual pollution, and excessive visitor traffic. Excessive traffic meant 2 pickup trucks and a minivan driven by a former Army medic named Roy who walked with a cane. I ignored the letter. Cynthia sent another. Then she began photographing my guests from the county road, calling wildlife officers and telling neighbors that my lake was attracting dangerous outsiders. What she did not tell them was that a development company had recently proposed a luxury wellness lodge beside Silver Pines, and the only access road they wanted ran directly across my property. I had refused to sell. Cynthia had promised the developers she could change my mind. Standing beside that poisoned water, watching her SUV disappear beyond the trees, I finally understood how far she was willing to go. She had not killed those fish because she hated fishing. She had done it because she needed my lake declared unsafe, my little guide service shut down, and my land cheap enough for her friends to buy. I picked up the meter Ellen had given me, looked at the chemical reading again, and felt something inside me settle into place. Cynthia believed she had attacked a lonely old man living on disability. What she had actually done was contaminate a natural water source in front of someone who had spent half his life investigating contaminated water. I did not call Cynthia, and I did not march up to her house waving the meter like some angry old man in a neighborhood dispute. Because 34 years around public utilities had taught me something useful. The person who starts shouting first usually gives the other side time to hide the paperwork. I took photographs of the shoreline, collected water samples in clean glass jars, marked the time and location of each one, then called an old friend named Frank Delaney, a state environmental investigator I had worked with back when we were both young enough to believe bad backs only happen to other people. Frank arrived that afternoon in a faded government pickup carrying enough testing equipment to make my little meter look like a toy. He spent 3 hours walking the lake, taking samples, checking the creek, and studying the dead fish. Then he crouched near the western bank and frowned. "Somebody dumped a concentrated chlorine compound here," he said. "Not a little either. This was deliberate." Before I could answer, tires crunched on the gravel behind us. Cynthia stepped out of her SUV with a county health inspector named Leonard Shaw, a narrow man in a tan jacket who wore a gold watch too expensive for his salary, and looked at my property the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. "Mr. Briggs," Leonard said, "we have received complaints that this lake may present a public health hazard." Frank slowly stood up, still wearing his state identification badge. "That is interesting," he said, "because I am standing here documenting an illegal chemical discharge." Leonard's face changed for half a second, just enough for me to notice. Cynthia recovered faster. "Walt has been operating an unregulated business and introducing contaminants through bait, fuel, and fish waste," she said. "Fish waste," I repeated. "In a lake with fish." She did not appreciate that. Leonard handed me a notice ordering me to drain and remediate the lake within 30 days or face fines exceeding $18,000. I looked at the paper, then at his watch. "Nice piece," I said. "Anniversary gift?" His hand disappeared into his pocket so quickly it might have been trained. Cynthia told me not to make this personal. That almost made me laugh. She had poisoned the place where I still talked to my dead wife, but apparently I was the one making things personal. The next morning, I drove to the county records building and spent 6 hours in a basement that smelled like dust, old carpet, and forgotten lawsuits. By late afternoon, I found what Cynthia had apparently never bothered to read. My property had been separated from the Silver Pines development before the association was formed, and the original agreement specifically exempted my land, lake, access road, and existing uses from association control. They had no authority to fine me, regulate my fishing guests, or order a single weed pull from my shoreline. I hired a property attorney named Rachel Kim with the last $2,700 in my savings account. Rachel was 42, calm in a way that made nervous people even more nervous, and after reviewing the documents, she leaned back and said, "Walt, this is not an HOA dispute. This is attempted land coercion with a paper trail." She sent formal notices to Cynthia, the association board, and the county inspector, demanding that all enforcement stop and all communications be preserved. For 2 days, everything went quiet. Then somebody hit the lake again. I woke before dawn Sunday to the smell of ammonia and found another cluster of trout floating near the eastern shore, their gills burned red. This time I was ready. I photographed everything, sealed samples, and called Frank before sunrise. While we were collecting evidence, my neighbor Martin Hale walked down the hill carrying his phone. Martin was a retired lineman who had spent most of his life minding his own business, but he looked shaken. "Walt," he said, "my security camera caught Cynthia's SUV on the service road at 1:43 this morning, headlights off." He showed me the footage, a dark vehicle creeping toward the lake, then returning 20 minutes later. One frame caught the rear hatch partly open, and inside were 2 white chemical containers. That was bad enough, but Martin had more. Cynthia had offered him $4,000 to say the timestamp on his camera was wrong. Rachel called that witness tampering. Frank called it panic. I called it the first crack in her perfect little smile. That evening, while checking the old property markers along the north shore, I noticed a black pipe hidden beneath wild blackberry vines. It was 4 inches wide, too straight for drainage, and far too heavy for irrigation. I followed it through the brush until it disappeared underground towards Silver Pines. My hands started trembling, not from fear, but from recognition. I had installed and inspected enough intake systems to know exactly what I was looking at. Someone had been pulling water from my lake. Frank returned the next morning with a pipe tracer and ground radar. The line ran nearly 900 feet beneath the trees and ended at a concrete utility building behind the Silver Pines clubhouse, a building residents had always been told stored swimming pool equipment. The door was unlocked. Inside, we found industrial filters, pressure tanks, chlorination pumps, and a distribution system feeding directly into the neighborhood water lines. Bolted above the control panel was a polished brass sign that read, "Clear Summit Spring Water, Pure Mountain Delivery." I stared at it for a long moment, then asked Frank the question I already knew the answer to. "How much water can this system move?" He checked the gauges. About 11,000 gallons a day, maybe more in summer. Silver Pines had 48 homes, and each family paid Cynthia's so-called water company $190 a month for premium spring water delivery. There were no trucks, no spring, and no delivery service. For 14 years, Cynthia had been stealing water from my lake, filtering it in secret, selling it back to her own neighbors, and pocketing more than $1.5 million. Suddenly, the poisoned fish, the fake inspections, and the pressure to sell all made sense. My fishing guests were bringing attention to the shoreline, and sooner or later somebody might have noticed the intake pipe. Cynthia did not just want my land for a resort road. She needed control of the lake to protect the most profitable lie she had ever told. Frank looked around the hidden treatment room and let out a low whistle. "Walt," he said, "she tried to poison the evidence, but she also poisoned the water she has been selling to the entire neighborhood." That was the moment the fight changed. I was no longer defending a fishing dock or a piece of family land. I was standing inside a secret water plant, surrounded by proof that 48 families had been paying to drink stolen water from a lake Cynthia had deliberately contaminated, and by the end of that week, every one of them was going to know exactly who had been holding the hose. Rachel moved faster than I thought lawyers could move without a judge chasing them. By Thursday morning, she had filed claims against Cynthia, the Silver Pines Association, Clear Summit Spring Water, and Leonard Shaw, while Frank sent the contamination results to state and federal investigators. Then a local reporter named Dana Price called me after Martin tipped her off, and by Sunday night the whole county was watching video of Cynthia's SUV creeping toward my lake at 1:43 in the morning, chemical containers visible through the open hatch, while Dana stood beside that hidden intake pipe explaining how 48 families had paid more than $1.5 million for water stolen from private property. Cynthia refused an interview, of course, but she did call me afterward. Her voice had lost that polished boardroom calm. "Walt," she said, "we can settle this privately. I can pay you $75,000 and arrange a fair purchase of your land." I looked out at Ellen's dock, at the empty chair beside mine, and almost admired the nerve it took to call theft, poisoning, and bribery a real estate misunderstanding. "Cynthia," I said, "you are not buying my land. You're explaining yourself to every family you lied to." She hung up. The next morning, I woke to the sound of metal screaming. Cynthia was down by the intake line in expensive workout clothes, swinging a sledgehammer of Frank's monitoring equipment like she could beat 14 years of evidence into the dirt. I recorded every second. On her third swing, the pipe split, water exploded across the bank, and the pressure sent a flood racing downhill toward the clubhouse utility room. Within minutes, the secret filtration system was underwater, electrical panels were sparking, and Cynthia stood knee-deep in mud holding the hammer that had destroyed her own operation. There are moments in life when justice arrives wearing a robe, and there are moments when it arrives through a broken 4-inch pipe at 11,000 gallons a day. That evening, Silver Pines lost water pressure, and Cynthia called an emergency association meeting to explain the temporary supply problem. The clubhouse was packed, every chair filled, people standing along the walls, angry residents clutching 14 years of bills. Rachel stood near the back. 2 federal agents blended into the crowd badly enough that even I could spot them. Cynthia took the microphone and blamed equipment failure at an outside supplier. Then an older woman named June Mercer raised her hand and asked the question that broke the room open. "Cynthia, where are the delivery trucks? Nobody here has ever seen one." A murmur spread through the crowd. Another resident stood and said the customer service number on his water bill went directly to Cynthia's personal phone. That was my cue. I walked to the front carrying Ellen's old water tester, connected my phone to the projector, and showed them everything. The night footage, the chemical reports, the underground pipe, the hidden treatment room, the fake company registration, and Cynthia swinging that hammer. I told them their premium mountain water came from my lake, that Cynthia had stolen roughly 11,000 gallons a day for 14 years, and that she had poisoned the same water she was selling them because my fishing guests were getting too close to her intake system. Cynthia jumped up and shouted that I was a bitter old man trying to destroy the community. I looked at her and said, "No, Cynthia, you destroyed the community the first time you decided your neighbors were customers you could lie to." Then Frank sent the shut-off command. Somewhere beneath the building, the intake valve closed, the pipes groaned, and every faucet in Silver Pines went dry. The silence lasted 3 full seconds before the room erupted. People shouted, cursed, cried, and demanded their money back. One of the federal agents stepped forward, showed her badge, and placed Cynthia under arrest for fraud, utility theft, environmental crimes, witness tampering, and destruction of evidence. Leonard Shaw was arrested the following week after investigators found deposits he could not explain and inspection orders he had forged. Cynthia eventually went to federal prison. The association's insurance paid for the lake restoration, and the new board signed a legal agreement to buy tested water from me at less than 1/3 of what residents had been paying. I used part of the settlement to restore the trout population and start the Ellen Briggs Veterans Fishing Program, free every Saturday morning. These days, I still sit on that dock with 2 cups of coffee, one for me and one beside the empty chair, because grief does not disappear just because justice finally shows up. But here is the part people still argue about. Some residents believe I should have shut off the water the moment I discovered the theft. even though families and elderly people would have suffered. Others say I waited too long and allowed them to keep drinking contaminated water while I built the case. I still wonder about that myself. So tell me honestly, if you had been standing where I was, would you have shut the system down immediately, or waited until you had enough proof to make sure the person responsible could never do it again? Leave your answer in the comments and share this story with someone who thinks a neighborhood title gives a person the right to control everything around them.